Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating slice of history found in the origins of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Based strictly on the historical records, we're unpacking a true story that honestly reads like a 19th century thriller. I mean, we're talking immense pressure, a massive human blunder, a secret conspiracy, and an elaborate, centuries-in-the-making backup plan. Whether you're already familiar with the history of the Book of Mormon or this is completely brand new to you, the sheer mechanics of how this crisis was resolved are incredibly compelling. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's jump right in. And we're actually going to drop right into the agonizing climax of our story. The year is 1828. A young Joseph Smith is pacing the floor, clenching his fists and just sobbing. He's just uttered these absolutely devastating words, "All is lost." You see, a 116-page handwritten manuscript, the one and only copy of a translation he'd been painstakingly working on for months, has completely vanished. Now, to understand the sheer gravity of this moment and how a simple borrowed manuscript could trigger such utter despair, we kind of need to rewind the clock and see exactly how we got here.
Which brings us to Section 1, the heavy lockbox. It was a time of constant paranoia. According to historical records, Joseph Smith was relentlessly besieged by aggressive treasure seekers. He literally couldn't let his guard down for a second to even begin the work of translating the ancient record he had obtained.
Enter Martin Harris. He was a wealthy and highly respected landowner in the area. Now, what's really interesting here is that Martin didn't just blindly accept Joseph's story. Not at all. He actively investigated. He had actually hired Joseph for farm work previously, so he knew the guy, but he still went out of his way to cross-examine Joseph's wife, Emma, and the rest of the family separately, just to see if their stories matched up. He even physically lifted the wooden lockbox containing the plates, noting that whatever was inside was incredibly heavy, way too heavy to be just lead or wood. After doing all this due diligence, the historical record states that Martin prayed and felt a profound divine conviction to support Joseph's work.
Moving on to Section 2. The skeptics and scholars. To escape that constant looming threat of theft, Joseph and his wife Emma moved to Pennsylvania. This move was actually financed by a $50 gift from Martin Harris. And get this, they famously had to hide the gold plates in a barrel of beans just to make the journey safely. So once they're finally settled in Pennsylvania, the translation process begins in earnest, with Emma often acting as Joseph's scribe. There's this brilliant little mini-narrative from the sources that perfectly captures the reality of their daily work. One day, while he's dictating the text, Joseph suddenly stops, goes completely pale, and asks with bewildered curiosity, "Emma, did Jerusalem have a wall around it?" When she confirmed it did, based on her own knowledge of the Bible, he was visibly relieved. For Emma, this moment was huge. It really highlighted how this young man, who could barely write a coherent letter and didn't know basic biblical history, was somehow dictating hours of complex ancient history without a single book or manuscript in front of him.
Meanwhile, Martin Harris wanted to verify the translation academically. He took a sample of the characters and Joseph's translation to some prominent scholars in New York City, including a Columbia College professor named Charles Anthon. As the historical texts report, Anthon initially examined the characters, verified their ancient origin, and even went so far as to write a certificate of authenticity. But the very moment Martin mentioned that an angel had revealed the plates to Joseph, the scholarly verification hit a rigid brick wall. Anthon demanded the certificate back and literally tore it to pieces, flatly stating there was no such thing as ministering angels. He told Martin to bring the plates to him, but when Martin explained they were sealed, Anthon famously replied, "I cannot read a sealed book." Martin left, ironically more convinced than ever that if the scholars couldn't do it, Joseph absolutely had to.
Section 3. The lost 116 pages. This is where we hit a devastating loss. Martin returns to help translate, but he's facing a growing problem back home. His highly suspicious wife, Lucy, who is firmly demanding to see proof. Let's look at how this builds. Martin asks Joseph for a massive favor. "Let me take the 116 pages back to New York." The tension in this moment is just palpable. Joseph is super wary. He asks God, and the answer is an absolute hard no. But Martin begs. He desperately needs this to save his peace at home. Joseph asks a second time. Again, the answer is no. The pressure is really mounting now. Martin pleads one more time. On the third attempt, the historical record states that God allowed it, but with incredibly strict conditions. Martin had to covenant to keep the pages locked up and only show them to a very specific, short list of family members. Martin agrees, takes the pages, and heads off.
What follows is a relentless, ticking clock of tragedy for Joseph and Emma. The very day after Martin leaves, Emma goes into an agonizing labor. She gives birth to a baby boy, but tragically, the frail newborn dies shortly after. The whole ordeal leaves Emma on the brink of death herself. For 2 straight weeks, Joseph never leaves her side. As Emma finally begins to recover, her anxiety shifts to the manuscript. She urges Joseph to leave her with her mother and take a stagecoach to find Martin. Joseph travels north, totally exhausted and terrified he has offended God. When he finally reaches his parents' home in Manchester, they invite Martin over for breakfast. And then they wait. 8 o'clock passes, 9, 10. For over 4 agonizing hours, they just wait in total silence.
Finally, Martin approaches the house. He's walking slowly, his eyes just glued to the ground. He comes inside, sits at the breakfast table, picks up his utensils, and then just drops them. He presses his hands to his temples and cries out, "I have lost my soul." Joseph jumps up and demands to know if the manuscript is gone. Martin confesses that he's ripped open beds and pillows, searched everywhere, but the pages are nowhere to be found. It is the ultimate disaster. Years of preparation, months of hiding, weeks of translating, all completely gone in an instant.
Section 4. The Divine Rebuke. Let's look at the spiritual consequences of this fallout. In the immediate aftermath of this disaster, Joseph received what is now known as Section 3 of the Doctrine and Covenants.
The spiritual consequence was immediate. According to the record, the angel Moroni appeared and actually took back the translation instruments. So the crucial point of the revelation that follows is how it balances absolute firmness with mercy. It severely reprimands Joseph, telling him that he feared man more than God by caving to Martin's persistent nagging. He's told he has lost his privileges for a season. Yet right at the top of the text, it establishes this foundational premise. The works and the designs and the purposes of God cannot be frustrated. Essentially, it's like God is saying, "You messed up, Joseph, but you haven't ruined the plan." It promises that God is merciful, and if Joseph repents, he'll be called back to the work.
But seriously, how exactly do you fix a lost, one-of-a-kind ancient translation? That brings us to Section 5, the ultimate backup plan.
We find the mechanics of this solution detailed in Doctrine and Covenants, Section 10. First, it outlines exactly what happened to those pages. It wasn't just a misplacement, it was an active conspiracy. According to the text, individuals had stolen the manuscript and were just waiting for Joseph to simply start over and retranslate the lost portion. Their trap was diabolical. If Joseph published a second translation, the thieves would take the original, literally alter the words, and publish it to show the 2 versions didn't match. They'd use this to claim Joseph was an absolute fraud who couldn't even reproduce his own work. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The trap is fully set.
So, what's the divine solution? It is breathtakingly simple but incredibly effective. The Lord commands Joseph, do not retranslate the lost pages, which were known as the Book of Lehi. Instead, translate a completely different set of records called the Small Plates of Nephi. Now, these small plates just so happen to cover the exact same historical time period as the lost pages, but from a more spiritual perspective. By translating a different account, the thieves' altered manuscript was rendered completely useless. They couldn't claim a contradiction because Joseph was publishing a totally different document. The conspiracy was completely derailed. And this brilliantly illustrates a profound theological concept of omniscience found in these texts. Theologians often debate, if God knows everything we're going to do we really have free will? Well, the narrative presented here argues that God uses foreknowledge not to force our actions, but to prepare for them. The text explains that nearly 1,000 years earlier, God prompted the ancient prophet Nephi to create these small plates without Nephi even knowing exactly why. God didn't force Martin to lose the pages, nor did he force Joseph to hand them over. Instead, knowing human fallibility, he prepared a backup plan centuries in advance, preserving their agency while still ensuring the work moved forward.
Which leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought. As we look at this historical narrative of absolute devastation turning into a masterclass in resilience and foresight, it really invites some personal reflection. When we face our own massive blunders, when we feel like all is lost, how might the lost pages in our own lives simply be making room for a perfectly prepared backup plan? The story of the 116 pages suggests that failure isn't the end of the design. Sometimes it's just the exact moment the backup plan is activated. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive leaves you eager to explore more of the fascinating mechanics behind history's most complex stories.